We all need to play on the same pitch. We need to understand the rules of the game we're playing, what sport we're actually playing, and how do you bring people with you on that journey.
David, it's good to have you on this show. Here we are in Manchester, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to this new Rebalancers podcast. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit about yourself to kick the show off?
Good morning, Neil Bally. Great to be here as well. My name is David Hodcroft, and I'm the infrastructure lead at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. Our mission is to make Greater Manchester the best place to grow up, to get on, and to grow old in the world.
That is a bold mission statement. Tell me what you obviously love Manchester. It's in everything you just said. But so tell me, how did your story as Manchester? Were you born here? Did you study here? Tell me a little bit about your story?
Yeah, sure. I was actually born in Manchester. It's a place called West Didsbury. The hospital's no longer there anymore. My parents lived in Sale, which is in Trafford, and during the 1980s they moved to Bury. So that's like my kind of general history. And then going back through the time my grandparents lived in Chorlton, and we used to go as a bit of a trip to the grandparents, a family, through the centre of Manchester. So I was then able to witness the various different changes underway in terms of regeneration schemes and the redevelopment of the city as well. And obviously being and growing up in Bury as well, which is to the north of the catchment of Greater Manchester, Bury in a way, just a valley. So again, I feel like I've been surrounded by water. I was really interested in science and geography, and that was my real interest. So when it came to making choice around university, I was looking through the various pro formas and brochures, and again, I could see people doing environmental science. It looked really exciting. They're doing pond dipping, and they're doing really kind of interesting things. And I turned to one side, there's a town planning course. It seems to be someone in a really stuffy office. So I thought, I don't want to do that. I want to do environmental science, environmental management. So I went to Manchester Metropolitan University, studied environmental management. So that was my first kind of introduction. And I kind of do remember on one day on the course, we did some water sampling in the river near here as well. So I think I was talking at the back of the class, and that's why I had to do that particular work as well.
Okay.
And then just bearing in mind some of my family, it's great to be in Ancoats today, because my parents are great at giving us a long history about the family and Manchester and the wider history. So some of my ancestors came here in the late 1800s from northern Italy. And they were based in the Ancoats area as well. And my dad, he's talking about his uncle who used to work in one of the buildings on a corner from here, and he was killed on the Anzio landings as well. So I've had that long history of kind of like growing up and understanding Manchester and Greater Manchester in its wider culture.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about this wider culture and history, because some of our listeners, are not from the UK, and they may be interested in getting a bit of the context of the city. Because I remember in some of our previous conversation, you shared this wonderful quote by the British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. Do you want to perhaps?
Yeah, there is that quote, like we say, what Manchester does today, the world does tomorrow. And again, there are these imageries of the bee. And so we've got that symbolises the worker bee and the people and the collective industrial nature of the conurbation. But again, if you go back in time, not that very long ago, so seeing population forecasts of the city, you see where there's a real decline in terms of the population in the city. It's almost hollowed out. And people say we're very, very close to a Detroit-like situation. So again, there was that loss of industrial jobs and manufacturing. People also moved out to the suburbs as well, so that kind of hollowed out the sense of the conurbation. And there has been a real push for the past 30, 40 years to repopulate the sense and also the wider regeneration aspirations, which are kind of like driven larger by Sir Howard Bernstein and the City Council team as well. So that's the kind of the longer history of how we're trying to regenerate the conurbation. But we also thrive on people being able to live their lives here and be able to fulfill their potential. It's a very kind of diverse place with that like long history of trying to work through problems and innovation as well.
So it's interesting because, as you said, as a city, industrial center, then it got hollowed out. Now, let's go back to your university degree. You had the planning, the urban planning part, you had the environmental. How did the two work together when you started looking at working in terms of, public office and in combining both of these and facilitating the regeneration of Manchester?
It's a really good question. So I probably then summarise when I finished university, did one degree. I was then looking around for kind of what kind of work you kind of go into. Some of my colleagues on my course, they were into the more traditional engineering, construction, professional services, private sector kind of routes. And I wanted to really work in the public sector, but I was looking around for what type of jobs could I do.
Mm-hmm.
So I applied for Bury Council at the time, and it was a temporary planning technician job. That's like the lowest of the low you
Right.
can go to. Then that in time, that became a permanent planning technician job. Then I really wanted to study town planning as well. And at the time, I wasn't really doing much environmental work. I was doing more like town centre regeneration, where we try to look at the towns themselves and how we try and improve their vitality and viability as well. So off of them went to a part-time course. And I think at the time, the options were either there's a full-time course at Manchester University, there's a course in Leeds and Sheffield, which did part-time, and there's one in Liverpool, John Moores, and that was environmental planning for 3 years. So I ended up going down environmental planning routes for 3 years, and obviously came back from that course and went on day release 1 day a week. And then we studied a whole range of different elements. So one area really focused in on was around habitat fragmentation and biodiversity, and biodiversity net gain was quite a new thing then. So we talked about landscape scale interventions. So that's one of the areas I focused in at university, really wanted to then apply that to the Greater Manchester context. And for those who are not familiar with the planning system, around this time you had a regional spatial strategy. So there's a regional plan, and Greater Manchester was informing that regional plan, and they obviously needed somebody who knew about infrastructure and environmental planning, because most planners generally focus on the homes and housing numbers, the employment side, transport. Then the next question is, what about waste planning? What about infrastructure? What about water quality? What about flooding? How do we address all these issues? So at that time as well, we were trying to produce almost an informal sub-regional spatial strategy to inform regional planning. So that was my kind of background to kind of sub-regional planning, but also the wider environmental planning perspective as well.
And at that time, you mentioned infrastructure do you believe nature was seen as infrastructure at that period of time, or was it seen, what was the perception of nature and what role it could play in terms of this kind of planning?
I think it was ecosystem services wasn't mentioned, but green infrastructure was.
Okay.
So from a planning perspective, at that time, you're talking around 2008 or 9, there was a real push to say, if we are planning for new developments, people understand where the home's going to be.
Yeah.
People understand where the transport network should be.
Yeah.
They generally get an understanding of we need energy and water supply, and floodings is an entity. And it was like the green infrastructure is really, really important. But beyond saying green infrastructure is really important, it's multifunctional, it was in there as a concept.
Yeah.
But it was in there to promote something, but it wasn't really, the challenge there was how would you actually fund and develop that when you're implementing growth on the ground? So looking at it from a Greater Manchester perspective, we had long debates about what green infrastructure actually meant in Greater Manchester, because we looked at conurbation. The conurbation is, if you zoom out of Greater Manchester, it is a bowl. So you can see you've got the mall areas around the conurbation. The rivers are the main conduits, and they flow into the centre, and they then flow out into the Mersey kind of via the Manchester Ship Canal. But then it's one thing to draw something green on a plan, but what does it actually mean in terms of how you're going to invest in it and for what particular outcome? And then there was another area of work which we're looking at ecological frameworks, which are about networks of habitats where they're connected by corridors. So this goes back to the late 1970s work about patch corridors and isolated islands. So in a way, we've transformed what's called biogeography.
Okay.
So if you think about how species move and hours in the sea, it's actually ecological systems today, and in conurbation like Greater Manchester, the habitats are islands surrounded by, you've got roads, developments, or you've got different conflicting land uses. How do we enable species to move across the landscape. So it's that landscape scale approach. And that's what we're implementing now through the local nature recovery strategies.
And what's interesting, what you were saying earlier on, is that green infrastructure, the decision on how to invest into it and the outcomes it would generate, was there a question about the value? Because the value of the green infrastructure wasn't quite well understood, it was very difficult to determine whether or not to invest into it, or am I completely wrong?
No, I think planning is planning. Planning has its limitations. So at one scale, you produce a plan which sets out your vision for the world you want it to be. You set out your objectives. You define where you want different types of development to be. You set out your individual policies of what you want development to do. But then planning at a more granular level, it's transactional.
Right.
So planning application comes in, and it's another part of planning is going to say, is that application, can I approve that or not?
Right.
So it's redevelopment led, but the world, as you know, investment isn't solely about new development regeneration, because that's about building a product which you can then rent and sell.
Yeah.
So you're thinking about, well, who else invests in the wider infrastructure system? And this is why my interest was in infrastructure planning, because the state doesn't control how the water companies operate. They're a separate regulated monopoly. The state doesn't control where we get our electricity supply from. That's a separate regulated monopoly. The Environment Agency are in charge of flood risk from the main rivers. They're also regulated in their own rights. And in Greater Manchester, we have Transport for Greater Manchester manage some aspects of the transport network. We've been doing some great work about integrated transport planning and how we manage the B network. So the planner's job is quite difficult. You're trying to bring together, it's easy to write a vision, isn't it? Everyone wants a vision, but how are you actually going to make it happen? Because you relied on other actors bringing forward that investment.
So how do you coordinate all this? How do you bring all these parties to align? I mean, you just said, the integrated transport plan. We are also familiar with the integrated water management plan. How do you get all these different parties to basically sit down around the table and compromise to hit a common objective? How do you get that kind of alignment?
Well, what we did, we were asked by one of our economic development forums who raised the issue, probably about 10 years ago now, who were saying, infrastructure is really important. We need to think about it. What are we doing? So I convened the various actors together. So it's electricity, digital, transport, water, etc., to really better understand what their investment plans are.
Yeah.
So they all work on different investment cycles. We want to understand what do they need from us, but also how can we help them? What are their individual drivers, and how can we align those investment plans at a geographical, spatial scale? Because one thing we do in Greater Manchester is we always take a place-based approach. So I'm sure you understand how there's that the wider narrative is England is the most kind of like centralised political structure in the world, isn't it? So you've got devolution for Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, and in England, it's very centralised systems. So you've got these individual departmental kind of systems, and in individual departments, they have their own individual teams. So since 2011, we've been going through various cycles of devolution. I think we're on our 7th cycle of devolution. So from 2025, next year, we'll be given a single integrated settlement in Greater Manchester. So that'll bring together various fragmented pots of funding, and we'll align that with our 10-year growth plans. So we're going to say we're going to have growth, regeneration, creating new homes, the jobs, the skills, but we need to integrate all of that with the right infrastructure as well.
Right.
And at the same time, it is still fragmented. So that I could give you a brief summary of where we came to on the integrated water management plan.
Yes, and I'd love to hear how it came out about, why did it come about, and what is its objective, and where you're at in terms of its journey. I'm also, perhaps as a follow-up question to that, I'm curious to see how does Manchester, as the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, compares to other cities like London, for example, and what are the learnings from both, if you may?
Yeah, I'll come to the latter point first. So
Okay.
we're different to London because you may be familiar with the history of in 1986, the previous government abolished county council structures.
Okay.
So Greater Manchester still agreed to collaborate as a federation structure all that time, but the Greater London Council still remains. So London still retained control over its bus and transport network,
Yeah.
which we didn't have that perspective. And also in London, there is still a two-tier structure. So there's a county level, metropolitan level in London, and then there's still the borough, 33 borough councils. In Greater Manchester, there are the 10 local authorities and the combined authority. The combined authority is an 11th local authority, and it's represented by the leaders of the 10. So we're not a separate, we are part of
Yeah.
the local authority in Greater Manchester. We're helping work with them for devolution to deliver our wider collective aspirations. But turning on to the flood risk perspective, again, there's been a myriad of reports over the years about flooding and how complex it is, and why does flooding keep happening, and there keep being frequent occurrences of flooding. So really, it went back to we had a really active local authority elected member in Bury actually at the time, and it was really pushing the issue of they're trying to get flood defences schemes into Bury based on previous flooding incidents. But every time they could have designed a flood defence, the design was overtopped by a new flooding incident. So they couldn't keep up with the flooding incidents. So he was really pushing for us to do kind of like, what are we doing about flood risks? We need to do more on this, but there is no capacity at local authority level. So when you take a step back and then we kind of think about, well, who is responsible for the issue of water? So we had a mayoral round table where the mayor convened the various different actors. And the mayor was saying, well, who's responsible for this? We were saying, it's quite a challenge because the environment agency have a role, local authorities have a role, the water companies have a role, and different parts of local government have a role. And then you work out, well, who regulates this system? And you couldn't make it any more complicated if you tried. So bearing in mind, the one thing it does in Great Manchester is rain. It rains, it lands somewhere, and it moves through a system. You probably got these different actors trying to work in isolation, managing water. So essentially, the water company historically have said, surface water lands on a hard standing area. That's not their responsibility. That's the responsibility of a local authority. But then now they've got the problems of spills on the outfalls, which is their responsibility. The Environment Agency are responsible for flooding, but really on a focus on main river flooding and coastal flooding.
Not pluvial flooding.
No, that's local authorities
Yeah,
who've got no capacity, no
Yeah.
technical. So you're going, so collectively, do we have a plan for managing water at Great Manchester? And the answer was no, there is no plan. But there's lots of plans regionally, nationally, but we're saying there is no plan for managing water at Great Manchester. There is no plan, there is no vision, there is no objectives. So we're saying that clearly cannot be right. So we agreed to produce a plan, and bearing in mind the combined authority has no responsibility for this. So we have responsibility for improving the social, economic and environmental well-being of Greater Manchester, but we have no responsibility for managing water. But we can convene the right actors together. And the analogy I use, it's like transport. So if you don't bring together a transport system, you're going to end up with congestion.
Yeah.
So we brought the actors together and we developed a vision. And the vision really was, produced last year, was we want to manage Greater Manchester's water wherever it falls for socio-economic and environmental benefits. And we're quite specific about wherever it falls because we get our drinking water from the Lake Districts.
Mm.
So it's gravity fed. And we then drink it. It then goes down into the drains. But also we want to hold water on the land through sustainable drainage systems, ideally, rather than it lands on a hard standing, goes into a drain, and it creates a spill incident in a highway. So that's our vision, but we've got some really high level, simple objectives, which are around collaborating, looking at a variety of interventions to improve the water environment, improve climate resilience, and then lastly, want to involve the community, the business community, in delivering that vision.
In building that vision, was there an assessment that looked at what is the socioeconomic costs of not delivering on this plan? of having waterlands at different parts of Manchester that can flood different parts of it, that has an impact on society, that has an impact on businesses. In terms of building this vision, had you done an analysis of what is the socioeconomic cost of inaction in a way?
We didn't for that vision, but there have been various studies undertaken in the past looking at the benefits from investing in flood reduction, and also there have been studies which have happened post-flooding events to calculate the costs of flooding incidents as well. And then we look at the projections of climate change across the UK, but also in the northwest in Greater Manchester. The conclusion is it's going to be raining a lot more, but we're not going to be getting it in an even spread. You may get all the rain at once.
Yeah.
And then, again, as I mentioned before, if Greater Manchester is just this bowl, so if all that rain lands on the conurbation, how are we going to manage that? And part of the challenge we have is the flood defences we have, they're almost like designed to convey water quickly away from an area.
Yeah.
But lots of flood defences are kind of built 30 years ago. So they're built for a different climate change scenario. And then if we just quickly explain about how we then fund anything. So the UK government provides funding through the Environment Agency to fund flood defences. But their metrics are properties protected. So they have to demonstrate as a cost-benefit analysis to say, if we put X in, how many properties are protected? Does this meet a score or not? And we want to drive more nature-based solutions rather than concrete walls.
Why?
Concrete walls, well, I will paraphrase somebody else who works for another agency who will say, how many bricks do we need to keep putting on a wall? So every time there's a new climate change forecast, it never says it's getting better, does it?
No.
It always seems to be getting more and more intense. But then part of the challenge we have with that particular scenario is it doesn't protect businesses. It protects residential properties. And also, even though nationally we're trying to work more towards surface water interventions, they're more difficult to fund. So if you're delivering a traditional coastal linear flood defence scheme in a river, you just draw your map. I'm really simplifying this. Draw your map. You draw a line and go big wall, property protected, cost benefit analysis, tick a box, off you go. If you're saying we've now got a cluster of projects scattered around an urban area, that you can't assess each one individually because they'll never compete with a large scale scheme. So then the question is, how do we defend businesses? So if you can't defend businesses if they're a part of a larger residential area, but then the narrative is, the guidance is new development should not be located in areas of risk because the state should not be protecting commercial or other developments.
Yeah.
But then the problem is, in Greater Manchester, we're looking to redevelop brownfield land. Where's a brownfield land tend to be? Tend to be on areas where there's previously a mill. Where's a mill located? So now you've got a challenge.
Yeah.
And then looking at from the water company perspective, water companies are now driven. They're in where they're up to in their current investment cycle. They're waiting for the final determination next month, which will say how much they can spend from 2025. So there's a big significant increase in investments. Nature-based solutions are part of the mix. So I know, for example, there's a big storm overflow program which is trying to reduce the spills, 10 spills from a combined sewer outfall by 2050. So in the short term, they're building huge concrete tanks, multiple Olympic swimming pool size, scale, construction entities. And in that program, at 22% across the Northwest are nature-based. Because the challenge is to have to demonstrate it's delivering the benefit. So it's performance-led.
Yeah.
It's a holy water in a tank. You can measure it. You can demonstrate the benefit. But I said you're going to introduce some green infrastructure measures. You say, well, won't it do anything?
Yeah.
Although we all know in the future, those tanks won't be enough.
So is it that we are applying the the wrong metrics for? I'm just putting it out there. Are we applying the wrong metrics to green-based solutions? Effectively, we're taking gray solution metrics, applying it to green. Is that the right way? I don't know. Should we be developing a new set of metrics? Perhaps. But before you answer this question, one of the things I'm keen to get from you also is Manchester is a vibrant, growing city. That means you're going to need new housing. For people that get around in those new housing development, you're going to need more transportation. You're going to need jobs, and you want to attract top employers. You want to attract employers who have digital data requirements, and you may need data centers also, which, an average data center consumes the same amount of water as 100,000 households. So I'll be curious to see how does your integrated water management plan tackles those issues. I'd love to get your insights.
Sure. Go back on in terms of the concepts of the integrated water management plan again. What it really, the summarize the 7 work streams. So one work stream is really was brought together an Excel spreadsheet with geospatial data, and the spreadsheet brought together programs from the Environment Agency, United Utilities, Transport Manchester, and our wider kind of housing and economic development growth land supply. We brought it together and we looked at some catchment areas and we said, oh, look, there's a cluster of activity here happening. So we're not careful, going to be ended up falling over each other, digging the roads up 3 or 4 times. And the kind of driver for that was partly around working together to be more efficient and effective at how you work together and collaborate. But also we have been successful working with United Utilities. Over the past 5 years, they kind of created a program called Green Recovery. So it was £12 million across the Northwest, 9 million in Greater Manchester. And the idea for that is United Utilities can invest in intervention in the urban area when that removes surface water from the network.
Okay.
So that's talking about, town centre regeneration schemes, investing in new interchanges you may see in the Stockport interchange, because that benefits them because the water's not in their network and it delivers wider social economic benefits. So what we've been doing the past few years is we're making a case with United Utilities and their regulator to invest in a program that's like 85 million over the next 5 years. So we're saying we spent 9 million over 5, we can now ramp up to 85 million, and that targeting certain catchment areas where we can make the urban area more porous, how that kind of sponge city analogy. Yeah. And then the idea is, because we do have viability challenges, if you are regenerating brownfield land in the urban area, you want them to deliver the homes, so it has to make a return on investments. We want them to be net zero carbon. We want them to be, we want green infrastructure. We want biodiversity net game. We want green roofs. We want blue walls. We want everything. We want affordable housing. But at a planning level, there is trade-offs you have to make between, in some areas, you can't have everything.
Yeah.
So what's the most important thing to have that rounded sustainable development? But also how can we bring in funding from our partners to make that happen? So that's what we're trying to do on the water side. In the same way, working with the company who provide our power supply, we fed in our growth projections into their investment plan so they can make sure there is enough power in advance of development taking place. So that means we can deliver our kind of growth aspirations as well.
So if you have, for example, an Amazon or a Google or whoever who wants to set up shop in Manchester, they want to build a few data centers. There's this energy requirement. There's this water requirement. They want to make sure they have skilled people. So you've got to facilitate in some ways all of this because you want these kind of employers to be in Manchester. So how do you manage these kind of large energy and water requirements within your integrated water management plan?
As it is an excellent point, because that is quite a live issue about, it's one thing to feed in your growth forecast 2 years ago, but then the world's dynamic.
Yeah.
I'm dealing with a system, so we don't control electricity supply, we don't control the water supply. But I think by collaborating together, at least could understand what the impact is of these different developments in certain geographical locations. Because you're right, we kind of do need data centers, and then in the right place, they will create resilience in the country, but they do have quite extensive energy requirements and water cooling requirements. But if they drop into the wrong area where we're trying to deliver growth and regeneration, they create competing demands, we do need some way to look at those competing demands. And this is why we're working with the government on our 10-year growth plans, at least we can articulate what we're trying to achieve, by when, and how to use our flexible funding pots from next year to make sure we are kind of delivering our wider aspirations for growth and development as well.
You mentioned this word quite a few times, collaboration. Now, for collaboration to work, you also need effective leadership. So could you perhaps talk to me a little bit about that in terms of what has been GMC's approach to providing both?
Yeah, I think our core value is we've got three primary core values. One is collaboration, empowerment, and delivery. And people often think collaboration is just sitting around a table having a meeting. And I don't think it is. I think that's just information exchange.
Yeah.
So one way we've kind of, how we've evolved over 10 years is we've gone from that, you just talk about your plans, which is just an engagement activity, to me, collaboration moves along a linear process. You've gone from loose network to more integrated network to more integrated team working. So you've got a team that comes across from multiple organizations working together on a common goal, a common mission. But to do that needs an entire different culture and a leadership style. So you go back to that kind of more traditional hierarchical leadership style. It's more about, I'm in charge, I'm the manager, the leader. These are my team. I transactionally manage them. I tell them what to do. They get on and do it. But then what about if you're working in your team, your team's elsewhere in another team, but they're working on a common goal? That's a kind of a more, they call it a coaching, serving leadership style, which is underpinned by trust.
Yeah.
So it's quite a lot in that to say collaboration is more than meeting. It's you working together across multiple teams, building the culture, the behaviors, and the trust. But how do you build trust?
And it's interesting because I believe in your offices, you also host, people from United Utilities and people from EA. Is that what you mean? Like, it's not just about let's meet for the purpose. It's actually working together.
Yeah, well, about building trust with people and teams is about you understand what's driving their organization. You understand where they are inflexible because of the rules set by somebody else. But there are areas where we can work together on.
Yeah.
And we developed a team charter 12 months ago with the idea behind that was there are going to be areas where we're going to have challenges, where they're going to disagree, where they've got different competing pressures. But ultimately, coming back to the plan itself, what are we trying to do? We're trying to manage water differently. It's trying to manage water different for the benefits of the people in Greater Manchester. So how are we going to do that if we're working in silos? Everyone agrees we can't work in silos. We need to come together, but how do you measure there's a purpose to what you're doing? So it's purposeful engagement, collaboration. And the other challenge we have in that space is we're all being pushed in a way, there is that transformational way of working together, which is, that vision. You work together on a vision, everyone's buying into what we're doing. It's hard, it won't happen overnight. But at the same time, I'm sure you've got the same pressure to demonstrate transactional outputs. So how do you balance the two things? Well, but bearing in mind, that's what I said earlier, I don't control the system, so different government departments are setting the rules of the game. On the water side, the regulator is setting the rules to the water company. But what do you want to achieve in Greater Manchester? Because our powers are limited. So how do we use our convening, our influence, our collaborative power to try and get the best outcome for the people of Greater Manchester?
So you mentioned transformational way of working, and you are the convener. How do you also bring about this kind of new system thinking that includes nature-based solutions? Because as you said earlier on this podcast, that we can't just keep building walls higher and higher. A, there's a carbon cost to it, but B, it only gets us to a certain point. And to be able to manage water effectively in using nature as infrastructure, you need a lot of land. So how do you manage that part of the equation in this new way of thinking that we were just talking about?
I suppose in a way you need to go back to what do you mean by systems thinking.
Okay. Do you want to tell me
So how I interact,
how do you approach it? Yeah.
how I approach, how we did approach it
Okay.
is I do like a good diagram. So I create a diagram, a bubble diagram. So this sketched out all the actors, how they're regulated, what's their role and what they're producing. And you then homing in on what's the leverage point. So you can't solve the world overnight.
No.
So where can you try and have an impact? And then try and focus it on those one or two elements and generate momentum about what we're trying to do. And then the kind of systems thinking is, again, going back to that point around a centralized government approach. So individual government departments will be focused on their own metrics. In the same way, there'll be individual teams in any organization who'll be in that, they're in their swim lane, are they? I need to get this done. But unless you've got other teams looking across the organization, thinking about, actually, what's the effect of what you're doing here? It might be a cascade effect of some implications. So I quite like the idea of, when you think about systems thinking, was it, to remind me which president it was it when the Roosevelt introduced the national parks?
Yes.
And they wanted the big game, didn't they? The big game, we need more big games. So they went away and removed all predators. The population of the big game exploded. Then what happened? They ate all the food and then they all died.
Yeah.
So it's like, you need to understand how the system works, but what's the impact of what you're going to do? And has a knock-on effect elsewhere? And often now we're driven by that kind of short-term delivery, must make an impact today role. That can have a negative effect because you're not focusing on the longer term. So yeah, that's kind of, it's a way of, in my mind, I always try and juggle those things between, you need to have a vision, but we're always visioning, we're daydreaming, but you need to be making meaningful progress. And one thing I probably didn't outline earlier is the Integrated Water Management Plan. It's a partnership maturity framework. So we set out a goal saying, we are here in 2023, and by 2030-40, this is what we should be doing as a collaborative structure. So you can see how we're evolving as a structure to be more integrated.
To be more integrated and to be more resilient. And how do you, because I totally understand the point you're making, you have immediate requirements,
yeah.
And at the end, concrete and steel does that really well. And also, especially if you're a regulated body, like United Utilities or any other one, you have to meet those requirements. But if you want to build long-term resiliency, to achieve that long-term vision, you have to look outside of just traditional concrete and steel. So again, it's I'm trying to get from you this view of, how does this collaborative approach also comes down to perhaps nature-based solutions. I mean, because again, one of the things from our experience is that there's multiple landowners.
Yes.
They each have their own agendas, which comes back to a lot of the points you were making. How do you get them to collaborate to reach this common objective of, we want to reduce flooding, we want to improve water quality, we want to, all those points related to water that we want to tackle. What role does GMCA play in this myriad of stakeholders?
And often go back to, well, there's two points in there is, what do we mean by nature-based?
Okay.
At one level, I could say it's on the highway, rather than it all being tarmacked, you have a little box and you've got gravel in the box and the walls go through the gravel bits.
Yeah.
Or it's a pond, or it's a slowing down the flow, or it's planting trees. And then the other aspect is follow the money. So who's going to pay for this?
Yeah.
What metrics are they using? And you mentioned systems thinking. And often, if you take a step back and look at a football game or rugby game, whatever, and you're thinking, focus less on the players, focus on the rules of the game. So what are the rules of the game? And at the moment, on the water side, there's been multiple announcements made around water reform. It's not good enough. We need to change how we're working together. But those rules are still being changed. In the same way, we've got a single settlement for next year, looking at how are they going to deploy funding to deliver agreed outcomes between 2025 and 2030. So I think that point about where's the money coming from, what is in our control. So some things, if it's public state funding, then it's in our control to work with national governments to demonstrate how we can test and learn different approaches to deliver national outcomes and objectives. At the same time, understanding that there is no magic money tree.
Yeah.
So how do we deploy that funding to deliver wider benefits in a more efficient and effective way? In the same way for the water companies, they're using bill payers' money, which is you and I. So essentially, bill payer, taxpayer, we're all paying for something. How they kind of like bring that funding together so there is an efficiency in that process. So again, what I'm trying to here is follow the money, understand what the regulations are, what guides those different players and actors, and where would you focus in to make a real difference.
And there is, there's no such thing as a money tree, and the public sector is constantly under pressure for different budget requirements. Now, one of the things that GMCA has done is that it has put a bit of part of the money to try and incentivize, nature-related projects. Do you see the private sector following in terms of the leadership of GMCA in identifying and, in a sense, putting a bit of money to start those projects? Do you see the private sector playing a role? And do you have some examples perhaps you can share with us?
It could play a role if there is a clear benefit for them. So you often hear this kind of like the wider debate of who are the beneficiaries.
Yeah.
So it's kind of beneficiaries at what scale? How do you evidence what the benefit's going to be? What's the intervention actually going to be as well? How are you going to design that? At what catchment? And who's going to pay back?
Yeah.
On some of these elements. And you can see different types of development. So if you're investing in an asset, so nature is an asset class, or if you're investing in a commercial development or an infrastructure development, and you're going to be managing and maintaining that for 30, 40 years, what's the risk going to be to your asset? Do you know? And therefore, if you can invest in a way that manages that risk, or it manages water differently, then you will clearly pay. But again, that depends on who the benefit is, period of time, what level of risk is, how do we even communicate that risk?
David, let's look at some practical examples of how within GMCA you facilitated or played a leading part in encouraging projects that involve nature. Could you perhaps give me examples of where there were some successful outcomes or perhaps less successful, but what were the learnings that came out of it?
Yeah, sure. One of the highlights for me recently is one of United Utilities teams were providing feedback on one of their projects called Green Recovery.
Okay.
And this is where they were investing in Oldham Town Centre to get surface water out of their system. So feedback from their team was they commissioned a local supplier who then recruited apprenticeship roles in the area. So they were intervening directly, creating nature-based solutions, sustainable urban drainage systems in a town centre and a high-rail location, but they're also creating social value. So you're thinking that kind of how we invest in nature, but also what are the wider social, economic, environmental benefits of this? And I thought that was a really great example. And I think they were feeling about that. The residents really enjoy being engaged in the scheme as well, so they can directly see the benefits to them, but also this is what we mean by nature-based solutions, pointed to green, sustainable drainage systems in the highway. Another example we're working on is there is a development in Stockport Town Centre, so in Stockport. I think you've been there as well.
And literally just came yesterday.
So there's in 2019, we worked with Stockport Council to create a mayoral development corporation. So they've got big aspirations and they're bringing forward new housing developments. So there's a housing plot over 1,000 new dwellings. And we're trying to see how can we bring in funding from United Utilities from 2025 into that development scheme, so that development can fully disconnect from the surface water drainage system.
Yeah.
So if you followed a business as usual approach, that development would just be a concrete tank under the ground to hold the water. But we all agree we don't want concrete, because concrete generates carbon. You want the nature-based solution, but then there's a cost associated with that. So how can I get the water company to invest in a disconnection of the surface water system through using green or blue infrastructure, green walls, green roofs, that then delivers a benefit to the water company because they don't have water going in their system, create a spill, but it also means we can deliver a better design development as well.
And the thing is, I just came back from Stockport this morning, and it is very fascinating new development. You have this kind of old bus stop or warehouse that's looking to be changed, renovated. And I understand why someone like United Utilities would pay for that, but surely there must be room for the other participants in the area to contribute to it, because sustainable SUDS has a positive impact. I'm going to say also on the new properties that are being developed. They can increase the value of that property. So there would be perhaps, because SUDS are not always cheap. Sometimes there's real cost element. So they could contribute to that pot of money in addition to United Utilities. So do you have this kind of overarching view of who are all the participants in such a project to fund it?
I think that is an area where further work would be required. And we did ask that question. And I think the challenge I always have is it comes back to viability. So in some areas where we are regenerating, we are creating new land values. So at the moment, land values are low because it's difficult to invest in these areas now anyway, because there is no market. So the uplift in terms of putting the SUDs in place, I think the general feedback for the market is it will help to sell the property faster, but it won't necessarily increase the value of the property at the end.
Right.
But then that's to that wider point of who's the beneficiary going to be in society and who actually pays for these interventions.
Yeah, and sometimes the beneficiaries are further downstream, who had those kind of flooding elements to it because of the issues that are up north. Let's come back to you. Where do you see yourself in the next 5-10 years? What kind of planning work do you see yourself doing, and how would you have liked the integrated water management plan to have evolved? Well, what's your personal view on that?
Yeah, my personal view is, I think I may have said before to you about thinking in systems about how a system works, what changes we are making, what influence we're having nationally to change how the system works collectively, but also in that space of the next 5 years, we do need to deliver the devolution deal and the single settlement. And I always come back to that point of what kind of resilience do I need myself? Because we're in that point of, you may have heard a phrase from like Seneca about fear and hope are two sides of the same coin. So one perspective, you want to be really hopeful for the future, and the other is actually changing systems and policies and politics and how we work takes a long time to actually do that, but we do need to deliver benefits in the near term as well. But I'd like to be able to think in the future, we've got a clearer direction about how we are collaborating across the combined authority, but also more in a more integrated way with United Utilities, the water company, but also other infrastructure providers as well. Because I say collaboration is one thing, you come together, we take it to one level, but there is further work we can do by working more as a team.
And in terms of your colleagues in other cities, in the UK and around the world, they're listening to this podcast. What top tips would you like to share with them so that they could benefit from your experience, and at the same time, things you'd recommend for them to avoid, perhaps?
Oh, excellent question. I think we often do get visitors from other cities coming here and asking about Great Manchester. And I had some Dutch visitors a few months ago, and their question was, why do you like tarmac so much?
So why do you like tarmac?
I was like, not me personally. But they're like, oh, you slap it all over the floor, and there's highways around the tree bases. And but again, in the Netherlands, you probably think about how they manage water from the outset.
Yeah.
is it Pompidou Centre? Is it in,
Yeah,
no, it's,
yeah, in France, Paris, yeah,
it's got all the workings are on the outside.
Yes,
we
correct.
we forget about the workings. We just assume it's taken care of.
Yes.
So I think my lesson would be to have a vision. You need to have a vision for working together, but really clear who are the actors you need to involve at the right senior level and get that senior level chief executive buy-in, but also then have a clear plan of action about how you are going to move forward together and how are you going to mature together, but also what your challenge points going to be. So having that honest, open conversation about are we making progress in the right direction?
Yeah.
And how do you honestly assess yourself against that? Otherwise, it's really easy to produce a strategy, and everyone likes a strategy. Stick it on the wall, been produced, we're going to do our thing. I'm really into that scrutiny and accountability.
Yeah.
So I want someone to scrutinize what we're doing. I want someone to hold us to account. If we're not doing what we're doing, we need to be really transparent. Why not? Is it because of the people, how we're working? Is it the system needs to change? But rather than saying there's a problem, there's no money, we can't do it, be really specific about what is it that's stopping us from doing this and focus on those particular leverage points.
I've got a new question for you, which is if you could go back in time and advise a younger version of David who's about to start university, what would you advise him to do? What path should he take?
That's another long philosophical question.
I'm asking you this question because you have developed all this experience. You know, you went through an interesting path outside university. You have a pretty good idea of what the future is going to look like, and also the challenges that you faced. You know, in terms of bringing different parties to collaborate around the table, in terms of fear and hope being the same side of the coin. What would you advise them? Because I'm thinking about also the graduates nowadays, what they would be thinking.
I would say trust your intuition, but also listen more, and also go to where people are, not where you are. Because often you or people will see something and think we just need to do this and this will be the solution. But unless they see what you see, you can't take them on that journey. So it's back to that point of we all need to play on the same pitch.
Yeah.
We need to understand the rules of the game we're playing, what sports we're actually playing, and how do you bring people with you on that journey?
Yeah.
Which is that how we buy into the vision, everyone understand the goals, understanding how we're going to work, how can they challenge what we're doing in an open way?
Now, the final question is, if you could choose the next two guests we have on this show, who would you like to listen to on our forthcoming podcasts?
If you want to talk about nature-based solutions, there are people in Great Manchester who are doing some great work on natural capital. So my colleague, Krista Patrick, will talk a lot about biodiversity net gain. And I also have another colleague who works for Jacobs Engineering Company. And I was speaking to him last Friday about the rules of the game and how the rules are changing a little bit and how we actually look at multifunctional benefits. What tools do we use? How we're assessing benefits against different capital measurements, how you do it. So everyone's to know what's the social, economic, environmental benefits. And intuitively, working together must be a good thing. How do you prove it? How do I prove the added value? So how many new jobs have you created? How much disruption have you avoided? How much BNG have you created? How do I do that? And sometimes you need the rule up front to then measure it later on. But there is a lot of work in that space. But that's what I need to communicate back into my system as well.
Perfect. Well, listen, David, it's been great having you on this show. I can't wait to see the next collaboration. But you got one more point. Go ahead.
I got one more question for
Yes.
you.
Okay.
I would like you to read a passage. I've highlighted this for. Just have a quick read of the area in green before you bounce and pick which passage to read out.
Here?
Yeah, let's read through.
So, living successfully in a world of complex systems means expanding not only time horizons and thought horizons above all, it means expanding the horizons of caring. There are moral reasons for doing that, of course, and if moral arguments are not sufficient, then systems thinking provides the practical reasons to back up the moral ones. The real system is interconnected. No part of the human race is separate, either from other human beings or from the global ecosystem. It will not be possible in this integrated world for your heart to succeed if your lungs fail, or for your company to succeed if your workers fail, or for the rich in Los Angeles to succeed if the poor in Los Angeles fail, or for Europe to succeed if Africa fails, or for the global economy to succeed if the global economic environment fails. I couldn't agree more. We're all interconnected, and we need to have more of this kind of thinking in everything that we do. So thank you again, Dave.
Thank you, Ali. It's good.
Thank you. Cheers.